All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. And while we're waiting for people to join, a couple quick housekeeping announcements. We've got everybody muted just to reduce background noise. You're also welcome to turn off your video feed. Oh, do we have? Yeah. And we'll recommend that you watch the program in speaker view. You can submit questions via the chat and we'll make sure to answer them all by the end of the program. And if anyone has any questions, you can chat me during the program too, and I'll try and answer.
That's a very optimistic view that we'll be able to answer all the questions.
Well, you will, Matt. I won't. See, just a quick upcoming programs. Actually, this Sunday, April 11th at 2 p.m., we're having a virtual Eyes on Owls program, which is going to be co-hosted with Farrington Nature Link. They're also based in Lincoln, and the registration is still open for that. So if you're interested, it looks a little rainy on Sunday. It's a nice afternoon activity. And the people who do it, Eyes on Owls, Mark and Marcia Wilson, are really phenomenal. And then next Wednesday, April 14th, we are continuing. This will be the second in our On Belonging in Outdoor Spaces speaker series. And that will be featuring Evelyn Ritz, who is a visual artist. And it's a really great series, and we encourage you all to register. There's information on our website, lincolnconservation.org. And then we also are starting our spring birding walks. They'll be starting Sundays, starting April 25th. We haven't opened registration yet, but there is information up on our website so you can learn more. And those are going to be our first in-person programming since the pandemic started. So we'll be capping that at a pretty small group, and we hope people will feel safe and want to join us for those Sunday morning walks. All right, how are we doing on attendees? Welcome everyone who's just joining now. We'll get started in just a few minutes. All right, before we get going, I just wanted to give a quick introduction for Matt Burne. Matt Burne is the senior ecologist with the BSC Group and vice president of the Vernal Pool Association, also co-founder. And that is a nonprofit dedicated to the study, appreciation, and protection of vernal pools. Matt has authored and co-authored many publications, including Remote and Field Identification of Vernal Pools, Protecting Vernal Pools, a Model from Massachusetts, A Field Guide to the Dragonflies and Damselflies of Massachusetts, and A Field Guide to the Animals of Vernal Pools, all great reads. And we are so glad to have him here with us today. We usually host in-person a vernal pool walk in Lincoln with Matt, and this will be our first year doing it virtually, but Matt has wonderful pictures and is really a great speaker. So we're excited to have him joining us today. So Matt, with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And just as a reminder, everyone, you can put questions in the chat and we'll answer them at the end of the program.
Great. Well, thanks, Bryn. And thanks, Jeff, for inviting me. I hope you can see my screen. Good. Awesome. Okay. Well, it's nice to be with the folks at Lincoln again. It's a year now since I left the Walden Woods Project, and I miss coming to Lincoln on a regular basis. But I was just there last Saturday to visit the vernal pool out on the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust property out behind Donnellan's, and things are just fine there. You'll actually see a photo of that pool in a few moments. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be with you, and yeah, happy spring. Here we are. Hard to believe. Let's see. So yeah, I've been playing vernal pools for a long time, and you know, I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of questions I can get stumped by tonight. Hopefully we come up with some interesting things to talk about when I'm done blathering on. So I'll talk about vernal pools, and yeah, just very briefly, sing for my supper, as it were. I've recently joined the BSC Group, which is a consulting firm. We do interdisciplinary engineering and environmental consulting. And we're growing and doing some really interesting things. The ecological group, based out of Worcester, does wetland science and wildlife surveys and licensing and permitting and all that good stuff. But one of the things I'm really excited to be involved in is nature-based solutions and green infrastructure design and some really innovative thinking around how we do our work, and hopefully make our impact on the world a little bit. Here, I'm unmuted now. Good, you can hear now? Okay, good. So I guess enough of singing for my supper. Okay, so as Bryn mentioned, I started with my colleague Leo Kenny the Vernal Pool Association back in 2006. We are a 501c3 dedicated to promoting the study, appreciation, and protection of vernal pools. One of the primary ways we do that is to get high quality images out into the world. And so most of the photographs I use tonight are compliments of the Vernal Pool Association. Myself and Leo are the primary photographers. And what we like to let people know is that if there are things that you see, or you know, if you're trying to do educational materials or programming or signage, that kind of thing, reach out to the Vernal Pool Association. We're happy to help people get images to support educational outreach primarily. So, so what is a vernal pool? I finally, after 20 years of trying to answer that question, I've come up with what I think is a reasonable starting place. Vernal pools are small forest ponds that tend to dry out. Simple. Of course, they're not all small. They don't all occur in the forest, and they don't all dry out. But it's a good starting place to get our heads around what we're talking about. So the typical New England vernal pool, vernal pools of Lincoln and surrounding areas, we're all glaciated. That's what formed the land around here. And most of our vernal pools tend to be kettle ponds, small kettle depressions. They usually fill in the fall with rising groundwater, and they'll hold water through the winter, freeze over, be nice little skating ponds. That's a great way to go looking for vernal pools you might explore in the springtime. By early spring, I should mention, if you notice back here, see my cursor, there's a stump in this photograph in the back corner here. By early spring, vernal pools are usually at their fullest as the ice is just coming out. But if you notice that stump out in the back of this photo, this makes actually an important point. Vernal pools are highly dynamic year to year. They vary a lot. So while I say that they're usually at their fullest in the early spring, they're not always at the same level every spring. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. Then usually by mid to late summer, a vernal pool will dry out completely. Or at the very least, dry out enough that fish can't survive. And that's really the critical ecological factor that makes vernal pools unique. They're aquatic ecosystems that don't support adult fish populations. And a whole host of organisms have come to rely on vernal pools. They've adapted to that kind of dynamic system. So just an example, this is a photograph from just 2 years ago, I think 2017, a relatively high water year. If you note the position of the water relative to this tree that's fallen over on the side, this is out in Lincoln. And then in 2015, actually, this is just last Saturday. The fallen tree is over here, and the water is quite a bit lower. This is just a very low water year. We were very droughty last year. And so the water just didn't come back as high or as soon as it usually does. And so it's going to be a tough year for vernal pools. They're probably going to dry out a lot sooner than they normally would. That's normal. That's what's expected, but it's an important element of the dynamism of these ecosystems. The one thing that's really important to bear in mind, however, is that the basins themselves, because they were mostly formed by glaciers, the basins are permanent. They are reliable year in and year out over decades and centuries. This, in fact, is the vernal pool that sets right next to the house site that where Henry Thoreau built his house out at Walden. And so in the middle 1850s, I know that Henry was listening to wood frogs and spring peepers at this vernal pool that I go out and listen to wood frogs and spring peepers at as often as I can. So while they are highly dynamic and year to year, they may be real full, they may be real empty. Some years they may not even fill up at all. Most, the basin itself is permanent and is going to be functioning as a vernal pool year in and year out. So that's an important sort of thing to keep in mind about these ecosystems. So like I said, a whole bunch of organisms have adapted their life cycles to take advantage of this unique ecosystem. And the most notable, the most charismatic are a handful of salamanders and frogs, amphibians, and a couple of invertebrates. So the spotted salamander is probably the best known of the vernal pool dependent organisms. It has some close relatives, the blue spotted salamander and Jefferson salamander. And then the marbled salamander. This rounds out the New England vernal pool obligate and bistomatid salamanders, the mole salamanders that are all vernal pool dependent and occur in New England. For what it's worth, the marbled salamander is a threatened species in Massachusetts, state listed as threatened. And the blue spotted and Jefferson salamanders are both special concern. So those are all pretty uncommon species. The wood frog is an extremely common frog species found all across the Massachusetts. And interestingly enough, it has the farthest northern distribution of any frog in North America, in part because it can tolerate freezing, which is pretty interesting. There is a whole host of invertebrate species that are dependent on vernal pools. I'll cover a few of them, but the most notable and the most easy to recognize in the field are the fairy shrimp. And so these species, these 5 amphibians and 1 invertebrate, make up what we refer to as vernal pool obligate indicator species. And so that will have some bearing a little later in the talk when we talk about documenting vernal pools. So let's take a quick look at the life cycle of the bald eagle of vernal pools, the spotted salamander. How can you not love a spotted salamander? Perpetual smile on its face, rubbery 6.5, 7-inch long salamander. They're just cute and really neat to encounter in the wild. They're difficult to encounter, you have to work at it, but they are neat to find. Oh, I should mention, one of the things in the last few years, a friend of mine who teaches at teaches a wetland course at Mass Art, the Mass College of Art, invited me to do a guest lecture on vernal pools, and so I had a lot of fun sort of punctuating my usual natural history talk with art that comes straight from observations from the field. And so I'm going to pepper that. I decided to include that tonight. So I hope you enjoy that. But this photograph of early spring rain, it's about as cold and raw as it gets in New England in the early spring, just after ice comes out, 40 degrees, gray, raining hard. This is the time. This is when you go out and look for vernal pools. And MC Escher, I know he knew vernal pools. This is so evocative. This rippled surface print is so evocative of that early spring, early rain. I just love it. So these guys, because of this, their life history, they are terrestrial. These animals, the spotted salamanders and the other mole salamanders, are terrestrial as adults. They live a long time. And they march down to their vernal pool in a spring migration that can be quite dramatic. And unfortunately, they have to cross roads quite often. And so that's actually our best time to encounter most of these species. In early spring rains, when it's nighttime, raining hard, that's when I like to go out and look for these things. That they're crossing roads. You can help them across the roads. You can sort of minimize mortality if you do it safely. But that's when these guys get active and come out of their underground burrows and begin their breeding migrations. They're quite often coming down to a vernal pool that looks quite like this. Often there's patches of snow on the ground and ice remnant on the pool surface. In fact, when I took my colleagues out to that vernal pool in Lincoln last Saturday, there was a fresh sheet of ice that had formed. So it's still can be quite cold period of time when these animals get rolling in the early spring. Spotted salamanders come together in a group that we refer to as congressing. The males do this sort of ritualized mating dance that results in the deposition of what are called spermatophores, these kind of white breadcrumbs that you can note on the bottom of the pool underneath this knot of salamanders. This is quite dramatic and something I really think everybody should see at least once in their life. It's really something to experience. A friend of mine, Abigail Rohrer, is a really incredible printmaker. She does wood engravings, and this is just a moment right out of this early spring experience. It's really fun to go out with a group of people when we finally get out of the mess that we're in, and go out and watch this happen. It's really something to see. Go out with flashlights and your rain slickers and have a nice evening watching salamanders cavort. Females pick up a packet of sperm from that spermatophore that was deposited, and a day or two later deposit a fertilized egg mass. And then over the course of 6 to 8 weeks, that egg mass develops. So spotted salamander egg masses are quite obvious. They get to be softball sized or a little bigger. They tend to be kind of elongated, sausage shaped, or what have you. They tend to be cloudy, whitish, and so they're not that hard to see. Quite often, though not always, they'll lay them all together. So you'll quite often find a lot of egg masses in the same location. And then the species that we have are fairly distinguishable by their egg masses. So we go out this time of year looking for egg masses, and we can distinguish between all the different species that are breeding at this time of year with a little bit of practice. This is a spotted salamander in the center with two flanked by blue spotted salamander egg masses. So you can see a little bit of a difference there. And once you get familiar with these, they're fairly easy to distinguish. Over the course of that development period, the larval development period of 6 to 8 weeks, a symbiotic alga develops inside the embryo, the egg, inside the egg. And that's pretty interesting. The alga consumes nitrogenous wastes from the embryo. It produces oxygen that helps the embryo. So it's a really wonderful symbiotic relationship. And it's kind of new science, but there's some understanding that that alga is actually present in the reproductive tract of these salamanders. It's not something that is encountered in the water, but it's actually brought to the water and deposited with the eggs. It's fascinating. You know, we may have photosynthetic vertebrates, and that's something that's kind of newly discovered, and there's some fresh science going on around that. Very interesting. Once the salamanders hatch out, they are quite obvious what they are. Once you're familiar with this larval form, you don't mistake it for anything else. A big wide head with eyes on the side, big brushy gills on the side of the head, a tail fin that extends the whole length of the body. They're quite unique. After about 2 months of development, they metamorphose and they turn into little salamanders that are ready to hike off into the woods and begin their adult lives. It can last 10 to 15 years. They're quite long-lived in the wild. And they'll breed in their second year usually, and then breed most years following that. There's a lot of interesting biology to learn about in vernal pools. Color differences between individuals. The spot patterns are a lot like fingerprints. You can use that to distinguish one animal from another. This isn't albinism. It's oh, the word's gonna escape me, of course. It's not albinism. It'll pop back into my head later. But strange color combinations. Limb regeneration is something that amphibians are known for. This is a wonderful series of photos from my friend Leo, who was photographing this larva as it developed. And on July 7th, he noticed that a predator in the tank with the animal had nipped off a leg. And just a week later, there was a limb bud, you can see. And then by the end of the month, the limb was fully formed back as though nothing had happened. I'm not saying that it wasn't traumatic for the larva, but it's pretty amazing that it was able to fully reform that limb. And it's actually something that scientists are thinking about, whether or not there are applications for human biology. Very fascinating stuff to still discover. One of the things that a good friend of mine, who was my first boss out of college, I worked for her at the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. At one point, I told her, you know, I don't think there's anything left to study. What can I do as a graduate program? There's nothing more to know. Little did I know. Every day I think of new things that we don't know anything about. She likes to make fun of me for that still, 20 years on. The marbled salamander, just very briefly, is similar, very similar life cycle, except that it starts its breeding habit in the fall. So it comes to a dry vernal pool, breeds, and when the water comes back, the eggs hatch. And by early spring, the larvae can be quite large and be a dominant predator in vernal pool systems where they occur. So it's a neat trick. It makes them very vulnerable to New England winters. And so they don't do terribly well. That's why they're state listed. as threatened. But as we anticipate changes in our climate, they may be pre-adapted to a warmer situation in the Northeast, and they may become more prevalent, which would be an interesting kind of tumble down effect of what should otherwise be a pretty terrible future. Excuse me for that. So wood frogs, we'll go over them sort of quickly, but they're an important component of vernal pool systems. They're, as I said before, very common, highly variable in their color. They can be this dark brown, almost fully black, to a very pale, rosy kind of color. They have a distinctive black mask around the eye and a fairly distinctive white upper lip. So that's how you can know a wood frog. They're only 2 inches or so in size. They breed early in the spring in vernal pools exclusively. I always love finding examples of frogs and toads in art from around the world, and this came out of the Museum of Fine Arts. These animals occur worldwide, and they are in the mythology of many cultures. Wood frogs, like salamanders, they deposit a single egg mass. It is kind of softball sized. It is round and fairly lumpy. That's one of the characteristics that we notice that distinguish them from salamanders. They're quite bumpy as a mass itself. Now, wood frogs very characteristically lay all the eggs together. So when you find the spot that the wood frogs lay, you're going to find all of the wood frogs. That just seems to be the way that they operate. In a pool with a lot of animals, it can be hundreds, even thousands of eggs. And each egg mass has 100 to 150 or so embryos in it. They go through a similar process. They have this symbiotic alga. They grow. They'll hatch in 2 to 3 weeks if the conditions are right. And then within a fairly short time, they become free swimming larvae, tadpoles, buzzing about in the pond, grazing on fungi and bacteria that are growing on the leaf litter and so forth. Over the course of 6 weeks to 8 weeks or so, they begin to become much more frog-like. And this is a wood frog just about ready to metamorphose. All of its limbs are formed. It's breathing air at this stage with terrestrial style lungs, and the tail begins to be absorbed and go away. And hopefully it reaches metamorphosis before this happens. And this is going to be one of those years where we can go out, most likely, and find plenty of photographs like this. These animals have chosen, essentially, from an evolutionary standpoint, to use a habitat that is risky. It doesn't have the risk of fish predation, but it does have the risk of drying out. And so that's a normal risk. It happens on a fairly regular basis. But more often than not, they make it to metamorphosis. And when they do, when things are right, there can be just scads and scads, that's the scientific term, of tadpoles ready to metamorphose and head out into the world and feed things. And this is what makes vernal pools so important. They are detrital systems. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but all the energy of a vernal pool starts with fallen leaves, and it turns into hopping frogs and slithering salamanders that feed snakes and birds and turtles and mammals and all sorts of things, and is a really important generator of biomass that feeds lots and lots of things. So on to some invertebrates, because there's a whole world of really neat stuff when you start looking at invertebrates in vernal pools, in wetlands generally. There's just so much biodiversity to explore. These are fairy shrimp. I mentioned them earlier. They are vernal pool obligate species. They have a life cycle that is adapted to this. It's an aquatic organism, 100%, but its encysted eggs have to dry out before they will hatch. And so, if you ever had the fun of going through a comic book and getting to the back of it and finding the ads for sea monkeys, that's what you were doing. If you sent your $1.50 off, or it might have been $1.75, I don't remember. 6 to 8 weeks later, you get a little packet of dust that you pour into some water, and $1.25. And a few days later, you'd hatch out, and you'd be able to watch fairy shrimp, what are actually brine shrimp. One of many hundreds of species of fairy shrimp, go through their life cycle. And if you were able to, you could actually collect the eggs, the encysted eggs that were deposited, and start the whole cycle over again. So they're really neat, and they're present in many vernal pools, not all certainly, but a lot, and relatively easy to see. You can just perch by the edge of a small vernal pool and look for little orange. They get to be about an inch and a half long. They're usually orange-ish, and it's this bright white forked tail can kind of catch your eye. So that's something to look for at a vernal pool. There are just so much biodiversity. There are what we lovingly refer to as wee beasties, Daphnia and copepods and ostracods, clam shrimp. We have 3 different species of clam shrimp in Massachusetts, closely related to fairy shrimp, but they have a bivalve carapace that looks a lot like a clam. 2 of them are globally rare, which is kind of neat. And we have them in Concord, at least. And they can just be a dense soup of biodiversity and biomass buzzing around in a February vernal pool. This is a vernal pool in February in Boxford last spring. Probably the densest collection of Daphnia and copepods and fairy shrimp I've ever seen. Very neat. So I mentioned they are detrital systems. They start with the leaf litter. The energy system starts with the leaf litter. And it starts by big chunks of leaves getting cut up into smaller chunks of leaves and smaller bits by a whole bunch of invertebrates primarily that clip things up and make leaf litter smaller and smaller, and that increases surface area and allows bacteria and fungi to colonize and become a very important food source for all those tadpoles that are growing, and it helps decomposition and all that good stuff. One of the really neat critters that are found in vernal pools are caddis flies. If you don't know caddis flies, I encourage you to go learn about them and experience them. Caddis flies, it's a worm-like bug. When it's an adult, it looks like a moth, basically. But as larvae, they're aquatic. And this is the head and first set of limbs of the larval caddisfly. And it built itself a case out of material that it cuts from the pool, little bits of leaves and twigs and so forth. And it makes provides some camouflage, provides some physical protection, and actually increases the ability to take oxygen out of a pretty oxygen poor environment by undulating the body inside the case, and creating a flow of water through the case. Pretty interesting adaptations. And once you start going down that road, there's lots of different ways that organisms deal with getting oxygen in vernal pools and dealing with the dry periods. There's just lots of neat biology to learn. One of the things that's important about caddisflies is that that case that they build is persistent. So they pupate inside the case, And when they're metamorphosed, they cut their way out, climb up some vegetation to the edge of the surface of the water, dry off, and then fly away and do their adulting. But that case that they made is persistent, and it's a good way to look in a dry environment that looks like it might have had water, to find a biological indicator of an aquatic condition. So we use that a lot in wetland delineation and wetland evaluation to see whether or not the hydrology is there. If water sticks around a long time, you're likely to find caddis flies and snail shells and other things of that nature. And one of the really neat things that someone has decided to do is to make jewelry. There's an artist in France who is the first that I'm aware of that did this. There's several now. But he brought caddis flies into his studio and teased them gently out of the shell that they had made and gave them gold and pearls and precious gems and let them rebuild their case out of those precious materials. And then when they metamorphose and fly off and go be adult caddis flies, they leave behind these really pretty remarkable pieces of art that I just think are pretty cool. Like I said before, the biodiversity of invertebrates is amazing. This is an aquatic phase of a mite. These have ridiculously complex life cycles, but some of them have an aquatic phase and very common in vernal pools. There is something, if you're familiar with hydra and corals and things, this is a closely related freshwater hydra. It's a cnidarian that is called the ghost moss animal. It's very, very minuscule. I don't know how I noticed this. This actually is in a vernal pool in Concord. I've found this twice in my life, both of them in Concord, which is interesting. I don't know what that means. But this is what it looks like in real life. I don't know why I noticed it and said to myself, oh, I think that's a ghost moss animal. But sure enough, got it back under a microscope and it was quite beautiful. So there's just some very strange things in vernal pools. Vernal pools are free of fish, but they are not free of predators, and that's an important ecological fact. This is a dragonfly larva. It's one of the eschnids. They get to be about 3 inches in size, and they are fierce predators. And they will eat a salamander larva toot sweet. So there's a lot of predation that happens in vernal pools. So they're not all happy places, but they are free of fish, which is a start. I was working for Betsy Colburn at the Mass Audubon in Lincoln back, I don't know, a long time ago, doing my master's work. And I was looking at lots and lots of water boatmen under microscopes, and I fell in love with their tiger stripe backs and the color variations, and they're just a really gorgeous little critter when you look at them closely under magnification. And I think they make a good potential t-shirt design someday. We'll see. Having trouble convincing them, the Vernal Pool Association, that would be a good t-shirt, but we'll get there one day. Leeches are not uncommon in vernal pools. I have never been bitten by a leech. I've never had one latch on. So, you know, I'm not terribly afraid of leeches, but they are present. They're predators. They'll eat eggs. They'll grab a tadpole or a salamander larvae and suck them dry. So they're an important part of vernal pool ecosystems. Vernal pools are really important to those obligate species that I mentioned, but just about every other amphibian, reptile, mammal, bird, an awful lot of wildlife use vernal pools. at some phase of their life. Green frogs and bullfrogs will, on the left here, will feed at vernal pools primarily. If you have a vernal pool that lasts a really long time, a couple of years, doesn't dry out every year, they can breed there. Leopard frogs, pickerel frogs are commonly encountered in vernal pools. Spotted turtles, we tend to think of as a vernal pool obligate reptile. Vernal pools are so important to them. We quite often find northern brown water snakes, ribbon snakes, garter snakes at vernal pools, a very, very important feeding resource. And then this amazing photograph of a barred owl with a frog, I just love. But it makes an important point about the connections between the production of animals in the pool and the animals around, that live around, and the connections to the broader landscape through these predatory interactions are really important. So I'll show you a few vernal pools, give you a sense of the different kind of ways they look. This is what I think of as an archetype, small, completely isolated. You can see a person on the edge of this for scale, quite small, you know, the size of a house or, you know, cabin or what have you. This is what I think of as the typical New England vernal pool. They can get bigger, and when they get bigger, they tend to hold water longer. And when they hold water longer, they tend to have different kinds of vegetation develop in them. This has buttonbush and winterberry, and probably has some blueberry around its edges and so forth. Maybe some grasses, aquatic grasses growing in it, sedges and that sort of thing. So as they get bigger and as they hold more water, the vegetation will tend to change. Vernal pools were even known in the French countryside in the middle 1800s. This is a favorite photograph, painting by Rousseau at the MFA that I love to come across every time we go. But we should go find that. It would be really neat to see if that exists. When they get really large, this is actually a couple acres in size, this particular pool. It's fairly shallow, and it holds water most years. It doesn't dry out, but for every 5 or 10 years. And so the aquatic vegetation is quite a bit thicker. So that is can be a characteristic of some vernal pools that we look for. Under the right circumstances, different zones of vegetation can emerge because of the regular hydrological cycling of these things. So this is a neat little pond on the on Cape Cod, where bands of vegetation in a bullseye pattern have set up because of the preferences of those different species for different amounts of water. Georgia O'Keeffe has always been one of my favorite artists, and I was thrilled to discover that she actually knew vernal pools. Early in her career, before she went out to the Southwest, she spent a lot of time in New York, and sure enough, pool in the woods, vernal pool. Not all vernal pools look kind of like what you think of. They're not all just sort of these lenticular isolated puddles. This is the flooded margin of a very large scrub shrub forested wetland. Works perfectly well. This is about a 300-meter stretch of moat around the side of this that had vernal pool breeding organisms all through it. River oxbows, meander scars, old sloughs, that kind of thing can quite often function as vernal pools. Even out in the interdunal swales, we'll quite often find things that work as vernal pool habitat. They won't have the salamanders because they can't live in the sand, but they do have the hydrology, and they have invertebrates and some other amphibians that are, have a preference for that kind of habitat. Not all vernal pools are natural. This is a backwater eddy that was created by the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, in the 30s, on Spot Pond Brook in Stoneham. It's one of my favorite places to go every spring because it's easy to see salamander breeding activity. But every so often it gets a perch in it or a pickerel. But for the most part, it holds water long enough and is free of fish, and so it works just fine. The salamanders found it. It worked, and it became a vernal pool, and that's often how it kind of comes together. So I'm kind of trying to lead toward a wrap up here, so we'll have a little time for discussion. I like to kind of put some thoughts in people's mind about the ways that we can improve vernal pools and make sure that we're protecting them in the long term. Invasive species, Lincoln is pretty cognizant of invasives, and you as a community, you work very hard to address invasive species. There are a lot that affect vernal pools. And going forward under, various climate scenarios, we anticipate greater challenges with invasive species. So staying on top of them when we can is really important. Getting trash out of these ecosystems is good. It's just better to keep these keep the cars out of there. Although we do use old broken down vehicles as a good indicator of wetland hydrology in New England. It's a good marker for wetlands. One thing that we see an awful lot too often around development sites is the use of, or the abandonment of, siltation fence. Siltation fence is really important for protecting wetland resources from siltation that happens during erosion and sedimentation that happens in construction projects. But these are what we use to intercept animals and stop them from moving into across the landscape when we're doing ecological research. It's a very effective way to stop animals from moving. And when we abandon these and we don't pull them out after development projects, it's a real problem. And so that's one thing that I always like to remind people to pay attention to. Road impacts are significant. And the town of Lincoln is very good over the years. You close down a couple of roads on heavy amphibian migration nights, and that's wonderful. Getting out and helping animals across the road is important because this is a major source of mortality for amphibians across the board. Granite curbing is really tough on a lot of different animals. So, working with planning boards and zoning boards to minimize the demand for vertical granite curbs, especially where there's wildlife crossings that are known, is really valuable. So in Massachusetts, we do have a process for documenting and protecting vernal pools called vernal pool certification. I probably put this graphic together a few years ago. There's over 8,000 now, I think. So a lot of vernal pools that have been documented for certification, but the certification certified vernal pools are more sort of clustered around people that were interested in documenting vernal pools than actually where vernal pools are. So a few years back in the early 2000s, I created a statewide survey using aerial photographs and found, an awful lot more. And so these data are available through the Mass GIS, available to anyone that has GIS or online with the Mass GIS Oliver data viewer. It's fun to explore that data. It's a good starting place if you want to document vernal pools for the potential of getting them certified and triggering some wetlands protection for them. Very, very briefly, vernal pool certification is a process of identifying a vernal pool and documenting the species that are using it. There's an obligate species method, so those documenting the breeding evidence of those species I mentioned, or documenting breeding evidence of a few other species that can use vernal pools, and showing that it dries out or and is free of fish is the other approach to certifying vernal pools. Vernal pool exploration requires some commitment. Basic equipment includes boots, a net, polarized sunglasses are really helpful, and then cameras to photograph what you find. I've promised the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species program this year that I would sing the praises of their newly minted and released Heritage Hub. It is a new web interface for reporting rare species in vernal pools. So I just want to make you aware of that. If you do have any interest in documenting rare species or vernal pools, this is the way to do it these days. If you just Google NHESP Heritage Hub, this will come up. You click on the login to create an account, set up an account, very simple. And then you get in, you have your own dashboard where you can keep track of things that you've documented and keep tabs on the status of that documentation and so forth. The process is very simple. You just go through a number of tabs and type in the data and upload your photos and stuff. It's a good interface. And one thing I'll mention is that the new Heritage Hub has a capacity to identify with an organization. So I've created a Vernal Pool Association organization in the Heritage Hub, and so encourage people to identify an observation with the Vernal Pool Association if you want to. So it's kind of a neat approach, and I encourage anyone who is interested to explore it and give it a whirl. It's important to get that data in so that we have a better sense of the distribution of these important resources around the state. At the end of the day, getting out and experiencing wildlife, I think, is really valuable. Particularly these days, kids spend way too much time inside, the drill. But getting people out to see something that's a little bit challenging, you got to get dirty and cold and wet usually, and it can be kind of miserable, but it's really amazing, and I really highly encourage it. Again, this is actually from Lincoln. It's wonderful to see this, but efforts to close roads or to in one way or another minimize the impacts of roads on populations of wildlife is really incalculably valuable. I had the great pleasure of teaching high school for only a short time. It was really challenging and really rewarding. And sending a bunch of kids out into a vernal pool in hip waders to catch whatever they could catch. These guys do not do this. So it was really, really entertaining to be a part of that. So I encourage, mindful exploration and careful, mindful exploration. Yeah, vernal pools are really cool, and it is my my distinct pleasure to talk to you about it. And I hope that I've created some questions, because if I answered all of them, I probably wouldn't believe it. So anyway, that's my presentation, and I'd be happy to talk about this further.
Well, thank you, Matt. That was really great. I always learn something new. And I say that after every program, and it really is true. So we've got a couple of questions, and I'll just start from the first one and work my way down the chat. So Jenny asked early on, they just sent in a first application to certify a vernal pool. Do you see a benefit between using a survey methodology such as a meander or transect, or no method?
I use meander. I find that I'm not disciplined enough to do transects reliably, and if it's important to do statistically valid sampling, then transects can be really valuable. But if you're just looking to, you want to know whether a vernal pool is a vernal pool, ultimately you're going to have to walk the whole thing, unless you're lucky and hit kind of the cluster of egg masses right off the bat. So I tend, when I do a vernal pool survey, I'm going to hunt through the whole thing.
Great. This question, I think you answered, but maybe you can just repeat the answer so we're sure we got it. Asking what the timing is between the female salamander taking up spermatophores and then laying her eggs.
So I said 1 to 2 days. I don't know if I'm right. I've always assumed that, and I actually I say that hoping nobody's going to call me on it. So thanks.
Now you just had to reiterate it.
In next year, if you have me back, I'll have the answer.
Great. Gwen asks, do you know exactly what triggers the migration of salamanders? Is it the rain, the weather? And she also says that the conditions haven't been quite right in the last few years for a big night. Do they just kind of at a certain point say, all right, we got to go for it?
Right. So that's actually an interesting question, and some curious discussion was happening on the vernal pool listserv this spring about just this fact. So spotted salamanders, the mole salamanders, live underground, and they they've got to be responding to a thawing ground, and temperatures underground and so forth. But are they paying attention to day length or night length? That would be my guess. That they're looking at, they're basing, at least on some level, basing that decision, so to speak, on day length. Wood frogs, on the other hand, are right at the surface, right under leaf litter, freezing. So their body is thawing out. And when their body thaws out, it probably tells them, time to go. So the observation was, as climate warms, is this going to become desynchronized? Are the wood frogs going to start sooner than the salamanders because they're thawing maybe in mid to late February, and the salamanders are still waiting for the day length to get to the right duration? I don't know. This is a really good question. So we don't know the answer to that. Science doesn't know the answer to that, to the best of my knowledge. And then I've talked long enough that I've forgotten the second part of the question.
I think you kind of answered it. Was, if there isn't a great one night where there's good conditions, do they?
Yeah, they do. They'll go when it's misty or damp, if it gets late enough in the season, or because salamanders are so long lived, they can just say, you know what, forget it this year. I'll come back next year. So there's a dynamic there.
That's interesting. We had a question from Courtney. How fast is the process of metamorphosis? How long does it take?
I don't know the exact answer to that. It's not fast, you know, on the order of days. But it interestingly is plastic in that, you know, if they, like I showed you that photograph of wood frogs that had been stranded by a drying pool. If they reach sort of this magic point, they can speed up. But if they don't make it to that magic point, they're stuck. So you know, yeah, like I say, it's plastic, but they have to get to some, and an embryologist could actually probably tell you what the developmental stage is. I am not that person, but but yeah, it's variable, but
That's interesting.
yeah.
Question from Amy. Could you talk about the blue spotted Jeff complex or female populations?
These are tough questions. Yeah, so the blue spotted salamanders are what we refer to as the Jefferson complex salamanders. It's this really complicated biology that's kind of interesting. It gets at the very question of what is a species. And so the blue spotted salamander and the Jefferson salamander are very closely related. They are distinct species, but they hybridize. And there's this really, really wacky genetics that I can't explain in a short period of time. I probably couldn't even explain it well in a long period of time. But the genetics get all munched up, and there are populations that have polyploidy. So instead of 2 sets of chromosomes, they have 3 and 4 and 5 sets of chromosomes. And under the right conditions, they can breed without the presence of males. So you'll get populations of these polyploid individuals that are almost exclusively female, and they can reproduce more or less successfully. It's very interesting. And what I listened to a talk from someone in Michigan 2 years ago, and I never followed up on it, but it was very fascinating. Apparently, there was a term she used which had something to do with kleptogenesis. I think might have been it. But these salamanders, they require the presence of sperm to trigger some portion of the reproductive process. And they will take it from marbled salamander, from Jefferson salamanders, from spotted salamanders, maybe from marbled, whatever they can get. And I don't. This got into this put me underwater quickly. It's really fascinating stuff. But that's a broad brush answer.
That's good. Question from Susan. When you see frogs hopping over the road and it's not spring, are they still headed to vernal pools or headed back from pools?
Yes, yeah, it could be any number of things. Depending on the species, you know, frogs, they do have to return to their vernal pools, and that will be separated from the inward migration by some period, week, 2 weeks, whatever the case may be. Throughout the year, you'll see frogs migrating. You know, there are other frogs breed at different times of year. So you might, on a rainy night, you might be seeing leopard frogs or pickerel frogs or green frogs moving across the landscape to go do their breeding. Or you might just see animals under the right conditions moving around the landscape looking for food or a new habitat or what have you. So it could be any number of things.
Right.
Yeah.
Kind of building off of that, a question from Barbara. Do wood frogs breed each year or only once in their lifetime?
They're very short-lived, you know, 2 or 3 years. So they're going to breed every opportunity they get.
And she also wondered if marbled salamanders are eating the fairy shrimp that hatch in early February.
Presumably they are. I've not seen that. I don't know from personal experience that they eat fairy shrimp, but there's no reason they wouldn't. I would entirely expect that.
And another question from Barbara, do only the male salamanders congress, or do females join that?
So the females come into the pool while the congressing is occurring. They will, so the congressing is happening, the spermatophores are being deposited where the congress happens. So the females come to that spot. And there's some degree of interaction to we theorize to direct a female toward an individual's spermatophore, but yeah, so they come into that congress. They're not part of the dance per se, but they are there.
That's interesting. I think we have time for just a few more. So if you have any last questions, please write them into the chat. A question from Courtney: are there tardigrades in vernal pools? And maybe you can teach me what those are too.
Yeah, the water bears. I don't know, actually. I've never heard of them being described from vernal pools, but I believe that they are very common in aquatic ecosystems. So let's find them. Tardigrades are these microscopic, weird bear-shaped creatures. I don't even know, phylogenetically, I don't even know what they are. But they're really like, they're really resilient, and they can withstand drying and freezing and, decades or centuries suspended. It's very strange biology. And I can't imagine that they're not in vernal pools. So I think someone needs to find them.
Interesting. So just to close, one last question from me. Are the wood frogs still singing, or have they kind of wrapped up for the season now?
They have almost certainly wrapped up for the season, particularly around here. They were done. So a week and a half ago, they were in full chorus over at the pool behind Donnellan's. And the eggs were far enough along that my suspicion is that population was done. So if you're lucky, you might find a population that still had some calling going on, but my guess is that it's done.
Yeah, it seems earlier this year for some reason.
I know.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you, Matt, for a really wonderful presentation.
My pleasure.
I like the addition of the artwork.
Oh, good.
That was nice.
Me too. Me too. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you.